Welcome. We're happy to have you here at Moment to Moment here at Ubaba Mkulu Sanctuary, where we're still in the middle of our series on the doctoral journey as a spiritual journey. So now, I hope you can see me, but there's a lot going on behind me. It's called the mountain mist. Look, take in the mountain mist. The mountain mist. It's like it's hugging you. It's all around. It's going everywhere, working with nature. I cannot overstate the importance of being in tune and being aligned with nature, our natural environment, which is a definite rudimentary aspect of indigenous ways of knowing. So now, today we're in episode 3, and we're talking about the literature review on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're talking about your spiritual self-review. So we're going to talk about how to approach a literature review. People have lots of questions about how to conduct a literature review, and there are a lot of videos out there on how to conduct a literature review. But we're not just going to talk about discussing how to conduct a literature review. We are going to talk about analogizing or comparing and contrasting the approach to the literature review with the approach to your spiritual self. As we've said earlier, the doctoral journey is a spiritual journey. And hopefully you've looked at the overview, which was our first episode. You've looked at the comparative analysis of the heart, your physical heart, your spiritual heart, and the role it plays in your body, and the research problem as the heart of your thesis. Also, it could be the heart of your dissertation. So this is for master students as well as doctoral students or those who are on their professional paths and where research is involved. So now we're working from an acronym today called ARISE. ARISE. We're talking about ARISE, and this is what it stands for. The A stands for assess, and we're going to talk about assessing your spiritual self-review and assessing your literature review. The R stands for reflect. The role of reflection or reflexive praxis, if you will, in considering your spiritual self-review and your literature review. We're going to talk about interrogation. The I stands for interrogate, about interrogating the literature and also interrogating your spiritual self along the same avenues. The S in ARISE is for select, about selecting a spiritual path to follow, just as you select the literature review path to follow in terms of what's been said before, what's been studied, what's not been studied, what's the gap in the literature, and things of that nature. And finally, the E in ARISE stands for engage. So if you didn't get a chance to write those down, let me just go over them right quick. I hope you have your pencil and papers always when you come to us. Have your pencil and paper ready. ARISE, assess, reflect, interrogate, select, and engage. Let's get going. Now, who are you spiritually? Now, this is the question that you want to ask yourself. And meditation, will help you start to answer those questions. So, what do you feel in terms of your own spirituality? How have you developed spiritually over the years? Is it tied to some type of religious doctrine? Because as I've said many times before, we're distinguishing between religion and spirituality. So you could think in terms of your viewpoint that your spirituality is about Christianity, or your spirituality is about Buddhism, or your spirituality is about Islam, or your spirituality is about Hinduism. Well, that's not what I'm talking about. All right? So let's divorce from that way of thinking. When I'm talking about spirituality, I'm talking about your relationship with the forces of nature. That means the sun, the moon, the mist, that's between us, the rain that's trickling down behind me. So the forces of nature, the ocean, the mountains, the rivers, the forest, the forces of nature in terms of your spirituality. Where do you stand then? When is the last time you spent time out there with nature? And in what ways are you able to distinguish religion from spirituality? So, with the spiritual self review, we're looking at an integrated assessment. And with the literature review, we're looking at, you guessed it, an integrated assessment. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, in terms of the integrated assessment of your own spirituality, you must define it for yourself. How did you come to be? More than biology. Who have you been in earlier incarnations? Now, I know some people are going to say there's no such thing as incarnation, but you know, some things are real whether we believe them or not. And oftentimes we find that the similar or the same souls incarnate in the same families. And this is what's important to understand and acknowledge in interrogating or coming to know your spiritual self. So you want to reflect on your definition of spirituality. How are you guided? How do you keep yourself spiritually centered? Do you meditate? Are you journaling? What are your tools for that? Because spirituality can either be a tool of liberation or it can be a tool of enslavement, particularly if it's too closely related to human concocted religions without us studying the historical aspect of these religions. Now, on the literature review, it's an integrated assessment, and the literature review or education. Let's just look at education. Let's back up for a minute. Education can be a tool of enslavement or a tool of liberation. And it all depends on the epistemological approach to education. So in an integrated assessment of the literature, how widely have you read? Are you going to literature with problems and issues already in mind, and you just want to fortify what you were already thinking? Or are you going into the literature with an open frame of reference where you're trying to discover where what you have concocted as a research problem, which we talked about in an earlier episode, and it lives in the literature? So how are you assessing this literature? What are your parameters for a systemic literature review? Or are you letting the literature talk to you? Are you open enough for the literature to be able to guide you, as opposed to you coming with preconceived notions of how you think the literature could be playing out, because you're coming in here with a problem and you're coming in here with a solution and you just want to do collect a bunch of data and analyze it and say you were right what you thought all along. We're not doing that here. All right. So we're more open to allowing the literature to talk to you. And one of the tools that will allow the literature review to be a tool of liberation as opposed to a tool of enslavement by just repeating and regurgitating westernized ways of knowing, because those are often the most prominent and prevalent coming through the literature. You need to do an annotated bibliography. And in that annotated bibliography, you need to go outside of what you're already thinking. Assess the literature in terms of various countries, in terms of various disciplines that intersect with where your research problem already lies. So when you are doing this assessment, the next phase is the reflection. The reflection. Now that you've assessed yourself spiritually, let's do that one first. You've assessed yourself spiritually. Now let's reflect on that. What do you know about your genealogy? What do you know about your ancestors? What do you know about your family lines? To what extent have you cleansed your lineages of things that your ancestors would have passed away with? Because remember that consciousness still exists. That spiritual consciousness still exists. Even the levels of indoctrination, they still exist when a person draws their last breath and when they return to Nakosi, when they return to the spirit world. What were they thinking when they passed? What had they not accomplished when they passed? What agonies or what pain were they feeling before they passed? What issues had they not resolved before they passed? Because these issues are going to be haunting them when they see the light and follow the light and journey over to the spiritual realm. Those things are still there. So to what extent have you inherited those problems, those issues, those spiritual aspects that have been used more so as a tool of indoctrination or as a tool of enslavement as opposed to a tool of liberation? How willing are you in this reflection to get to know your spiritual self and to go deep into your family history, the ones that went before you? What were they known for in the community? This will start to help you understand the emergence of a gap in your spiritual self and how you, in your tandem of working with nature, can come to know what is missing in your spiritual self, in the way that you treat people every day, in the way that you orientate yourself and your worldview, which we're going to be covering in a subsequent episode. What kind of childhood traumas are still plaguing you that you need to reflect upon that can help you uncover the liberatory aspect of your spiritual self? So in the reflection on the spiritual self, we want to focus on the family genealogy. What were they known for in the community? What were their likes and dislikes? So that we can tune into that and use that as a tool to help them move in a higher echelon where they are in the spirit world. And what is the emergence of a gap? A gap in terms of the spiritual enlightenment or the spiritual development of your family lines, that you can be the one. You can be the one to move that forward. In other words, what is that your role in the healing of the family lines because of what you're doing for your own spiritual self? How have you opened your heart and your ears and your eyes to the universe to reflect upon your spiritual self? Now, let's turn to the literature review aspect. The literature review, just like the spiritual self review, is never ending. There have been situations where an external examiner in a thesis can say things like, hey, I don't see where this is, contextualized in the literature. Or you can, this is a classic one. You can say in your thesis things like, no one else has researched ABC. And then here come your examiners. Well, you didn't see this literature that's discussing ABC. You didn't see that literature that's discussing ABC. So you don't want to make strong statements like that when you're assessing the literature. You can say something like, it seems that this is understudied, or it may be that scholars have not yet delved deeper into ABC. But once you start making those claims, you want to reflect on that and see how you can soften that language with a sense of humility. So now, just as you historicize your spiritual self in terms of your genealogy, you also want to historicize the literature review. Yeah. You need to bring in history, particularly pre-colonial indigenous history. This is missing. This is missing in the literature review. And regardless of what your discipline is, regardless of what the research problem is, there were pre-colonial, there were pre-slavery, pre-colonization, pre-apartheid activities going on about these things before settler colonialism and all these other isms, like capitalism, imperialism, and all that. Before all that happened, there's a history behind whatever this research problem is. The more you try to just draw currently or come up with some kind of current issue without bringing in the history of how that came to be, the less you're going to defeat the coloniality regime. And the coloniality regime is alive and well. And in the research, we want to obliterate that. We want to defy that. We want to not just diminish, but get rid of, alleviate that. By bringing in different ways of knowing and different epistemological approaches to the research. So when you are working on the literature review, you want to historicize it. Just as you have a genealogy in your literature, in your spiritual self, you you also have a genealogy. You have a genealogy in your literature review, and by that I mean, who are the scholars who have studied this, and what are they talking about? Where are they coming from? Let me give you an example of that. We often use pragmatism, and then we go and bring in John Dewey. And we talk about, oh, John Dewey was a pragmatist, and, he talked about this and he talked about that. But do we look at the fact that John Dewey was also writing things about that, people, African people or black people had smaller brains than white people, or were unable to reason logically like white people. So he wasn't just talking about this pragmatism or, bringing in experiences into curriculum development and things like that. No. You got to look further than that. What was he talking about at that time? And then you're going to go and embrace the scholars who have already told you where they stand epistemologically. No. This is why you must historicize the literature and understand where these scholars are coming from. How did they live? What were their beliefs in terms of people of different ethnicities or gender? How did they resonate with that? Or are you using what you can from these scholars to perpetuate the regime of coloniality? Because if you don't understand what it is that they were doing in their real lives when they were writing and the scholarly literature on that, then you're just perpetuating these same things. As opposed to doing that, you could look at things like Du Boisian pragmatism. William E.B. Du Bois. He also has a philosophy about pragmatism. But what is his philosophy about pragmatism? It's about Africanity. It's about African people in the diaspora being united and being a beacon of light for all people. It's not excluding people who do not have pigmentation. It's broadening the aspect to bring in different ways of knowing. So you want to look into that type of mentality when you're researching these scholars and draw in and historicize the literature review. And also, when you're historicizing the literature review, you don't want to ignore the periphery, because no single discipline can solve any issue. We know that now. Now we're moving toward holistic education. But holistic education is the same thing as indigenous education that existed prior to settler colonialism, prior to slavery, prior to all these isms that have occurred. So, in so doing, you will see emerging within the context of your research problem and by historicizing the literature and in looking into the genealogy of these scholars and what they're really about, what their research is really saying, and who it's affecting. There will be an emergence of the gap that gives rise to the research problem. Now, even though we talked about the research problem an episode ago as being the heart of the literature review, I'm making the same point that I made then. Remember, the research problem must come out of the literature review. The research problem cannot come out of whatever issues you have in your place of employment. It can't just come out of whatever's troubling you. It must live in the literature. It must come out of the literature. So by assessing the literature and reflecting upon the literature, you start to learn to open your ears and your heart to what the universe is saying. And the more that you can focus on the assessment and the reflection with regard to your spiritual self-review, the more your guardian angel or your higher self is going to become involved with your research. Because they want to see the world in a better place. The light workers, the people who are about light, they want to see these things improve. They want to see equity and fairness happen. And you can be a bastion of that light. So the more that you do that with your spiritual self as you're on the doctoral journey, the more it is that the emergence of the gap in the literature will become clear, and it will become clear in a way that it works toward epistemic freedom or cognitive justice, because it would be historicized, it would identify the trappings of coloniality and how to overcome that and move toward a more just and fair existence in terms of how we conduct research. So thanks again for being with us today. Please like the channel, subscribe to the channel, give us comments about what you have to say, what you think, and what you feel matters as we go on this journey or navigate this path about the doctoral journey, being in a spiritual journey. Also, come and visit us here at some of our retreats. We have another retreat coming up in April. If you're interested, pop us an email. I've put the email address on the board, and you'll be able to see that in the section where there are comments and information or description of the video. Contact us. You can register for our retreat where we come here to Baba Mkulu's sanctuary. And the retreat is focused on people who are on similar several levels of their work come together and, mushroom into a community of practice. So we look forward to seeing you there, and take care. All the best.